Nobody in the room looked at the car, except one man.
Scrap metal. No value here.
Thank you for letting me know.
What he saw in that car, no one else in the room could see. The car sat in the back corner of the auction hall, like something the building had forgotten to throw out. Dust covered the hood in a thin gray membrane. The paint, an unfortunate olive green that had clearly been applied by someone who did not love the car, was blistered and peeling along the fenders, and a handwritten tag dangled from the rearview mirror. With an estimate of $5,000 to $8,000, no reserve. Nobody stood near it. Nobody glanced at it. And then Margaret Bellamy, chief executive of Bellamy Crestmont Auctions, the most powerful name in luxury estate sales in Manhattan, walked past, looked down at the man, crouched beside it with a small flashlight in his hand, and said 4 words loud enough for the whole room to hear: scrap metal. No value here. The man in the worn black hoodie did not stand up. He did not argue. He kept looking under the chassis with the unhurried calm of someone who already knew something the rest of the room did not. What did Keanu Reeves see in that car that an entire room of certified appraisers had missed? The answer was worth $8 million. And it started with a lesson an old mechanic in Detroit had taught him 20 years before, on the set of a movie nobody remembers. Keanu finished loading the last toolbox into the passenger footwell of his pickup at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning. Checked the side mirror out of habit and pulled out of the narrow Greenpoint street where his arch motorcycle workshop sat on the ground floor of a converted brick warehouse. The sky was that particular shade of pre-dawn gray that arrives before the city really wakes up, and the traffic on the Pulaski Bridge was thin enough that he could see the water below clearly. Lila sat in the passenger seat beside him, 6 years old, her stuffed red fox, named Marbles, tucked under one arm. She had the habit her mother used to have, the habit of waking up already fully awake, no transitional period, no grogginess, just open eyes and immediate questions. "Which car is your favorite car in the whole world?" she asked, adjusting one of Marbles's ears with the focused seriousness of someone arranging an important matter. Keanu thought about it for a second, the way he always thought about her questions, without rushing, because she always knew when an answer had been rushed. "A car nobody else has looked at properly yet," he said. She nodded, as though this made complete sense. She tucked her chin against the top of the fox's head and watched the bridge cables slide past overhead. 6 years earlier, before he became her father, in the only way that mattered, Keanu had been on a long film shoot in Atlanta when his cousin Ellis died in a single-vehicle accident on the Cross-Bronx Expressway. Ellis had a daughter. Lila was 18 months old at the time, and her mother had left when she was a newborn. And the family arithmetic at the funeral had been short and brutal. There was Keanu, and there was a state-run facility in Yonkers, and there was nobody else. 8. He signed the papers 4 months later, and learned what it meant to fold a small pair of pajamas in the dark, without waking anyone up. He still acted. He still did the press tours. But he had also bought the workshop building, because Arch Motorcycle could not be his entire life anymore, and because the mechanic who had taught him everything he knew about engines, an old man, Vance Holloway, had once told him that, if he ever wanted to be useful in a real way, he should keep his hands on actual metal. Keanu kept Vance's 3-ring binders on a shelf above his bench. Photographs of factory prototypes from the early 60s. Handwritten notes on weld patterns and casting marks. A small archive of the kind of knowledge that lives in nobody's database. Today he was driving to the Upper East Side for a morning preview at a Bellamy Crestmont estate sale. The kind of event where old money's furniture and forgotten collections get cataloged and sold. He was not there for the Patek Philippe watches or the Impressionist oils. He was there for anything mechanical, anything overlooked, anything in the back of the catalog the main bidders would ignore. He parked the truck 2 blocks from the address, signed Lila into the complimentary care room that Bellamy provided near the main entrance. A small room with beanbag chairs and a television playing animated movies, kissed the top of her head, and walked through the tall front doors of the venue with his flashlight in his jacket pocket, and a black mask pulled up over his nose. He was not hiding from anyone in particular. He simply preferred being looked through rather than looked at. The main hall was high-ceilinged and already crowded with preview guests, all of them moving with the particular confidence of people accustomed to being in rooms where expensive things were displayed. Keanu moved along the edges, reading the lot tags methodically, pausing at a set of vintage tire-changing equipment and a crated collection of dashboard gauges from the 1950s. And then he turned the corner near the back wall and stopped. The car was pushed against the wall between two storage racks of framed artwork, half blocked by a rolling equipment cart, positioned as though whoever had placed it there had been actively trying to keep it out of the way. The paint, that dull olive green, was not original, not by decades. The bodywork was wrong for any production model he recognized, modified or partially stripped, the fender lines altered. But underneath all of that, visible only if you knew precisely where to look, the proportions of the roofline were unusual in a very specific way. Keanu crouched down and turned on his flashlight. He was still crouched there, angled beneath the driver's side door, when he heard footsteps stop nearby. He looked up. Margaret Bellamy was watching him with an expression that combined mild curiosity and something closer to impatience, the look of someone interrupted by a problem they did not ask for. She wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that had probably cost more than his monthly workshop rent, and her junior appraiser, a younger woman with a clipboard whom Keanu would later learn was named Devon Whitaker, stood half a step behind her. Margaret looked at the car, then at Keanu, then at the car again with the brief, efficient appraisal of someone who had already decided. "This lot has no real value," she said, her voice carrying cleanly in the high-ceilinged room. "It is here as a courtesy to the estate family. We did not want to refuse them." She paused, letting the silence settle, then added with a small precision that landed exactly where she intended it to. "I am not sure this preview is the right fit for certain budget ranges. There is a parts yard in Queens that handles items in this category for a fraction of the price." A few of the preview guests nearby glanced over. One or two almost smiled. Keanu did not stand up immediately. He looked at the car for another 2 seconds, the flashlight still in his hand. Then he stood and met Margaret's eyes through the mask, without any particular expression. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. His voice was quiet. The mask muffled it further. She moved on without registering anything about him, beyond the hoodie and the work boots. Devon Whitaker lingered for a moment, not obviously, just a beat longer than she needed to, and when Keanu glanced at her, she looked away first. There was something in her face he filed away and did not comment on. A man in a charcoal suit appeared briefly at the edge of the hall. Heavy set, a Patek Philippe Nautilus on the wrist, the easy movement of someone who spent a great deal of time in rooms like this, and had stopped noticing them years ago. He was Bennett Cross, a mid-level collector and dealer who had been buying and flipping specialty automotive lots for 2 decades. He looked at Lot 47 with the quick, practiced glance of someone sorting through a bin for something worth saving, found nothing that interested him, and moved on through the doorway. Keanu could see Lila standing at the threshold of the care room, marbles under her arm, looking out at him. He gave her a small nod. She disappeared back inside. He pocketed the flashlight and walked to the registration desk. The bidding room filled to about 60% capacity for the main session, and it thinned considerably after the marquee lots. A collection of estate jewelry and 2 significant paintings cleared in the first 40 minutes. Lot 47 was called near the end of the session, after the crowd had redistributed into smaller clusters of people checking their phones and finishing their coffee. The auctioneer, a Bellamy staff member, filling in for the final stretch, announced it with the same brisk neutral tone used for everything else. Lot 47, automotive item, estimated 5,000 to 8,000, sold as no warranty, no reserve. Bidding opens at 3,000. 3,000 became 5,000 in the first 30 seconds, which surprised nobody. Then the room went quiet again. The way rooms go quiet when nobody particularly wants something. Keanu raised his paddle at 8,000. Bennett Cross, positioned in a far corner with his arms crossed, noticed the bid and looked across the room for the first time with genuine attention. He raised his own paddle, 9,000. With the automatic reflex of a man who disliked losing to anyone, even things he did not actually want. 11,000, Keanu said. Bennett Cross studied him across the room. The hoodie, the careful posture, the way the man was watching the car rather than the auctioneer. Then he set his paddle down on the armrest. Not worth it, his expression said. Whatever this is, it is not worth a bidding war. The gavel came down. Devon Whitaker handled the paperwork at the side table, and she slid the bill of sale across the counter without making it obvious that she was watching his face. He pulled the mask down to sign. She read the signature. She paused. She read it again. She did not say anything, but the small professional smile she had been wearing went still around the edges, the way a smile goes still, when the muscles underneath learn something the face is not yet allowed to react to. What did you see in it? She asked, quiet enough that it would not carry. I am not certain yet, Keanu said, but I think I will know by the end of the week. She slid him the receipt without another word. Lila was waiting by the main entrance with a volunteer, marbles on her shoulder, watching the loading crew attach the small crane hook to the car's chassis. It is really dirty, she said when he lifted her up so she could see better. It has been waiting a long time, he said. He buckled her into the truck, glanced in the rearview mirror at the car now secured on the flatbed behind them, and drove back across the bridge toward Brooklyn. He worked alone in the workshop that first night after Lila was asleep upstairs. The overhead LED bars turned the space a clean, shadowless white, and Keanu moved around the car in a slow, outside-in pattern, the same approach Vance Holloway had always used, starting with the body and working toward what the body was hiding. The welds on the inner structure were the first thing. Not amateur work, not production line automation. These were hand-supplied spot welds with a distinctive spacing pattern that dated to a specific period and a specific tier of fabrication. Professional race team construction, early 60s. He photographed everything with his phone, each frame composed carefully enough that the resolution would hold under magnification. He worked without music, which was his habit. When something required the kind of concentration that sound interrupted, he opened the hood. The engine block sat in the bay with the quiet authority of something built to do one specific thing extremely well. He angled the flashlight toward the left face of the block, the inner surface, the one most people ignored because it faced the firewall and required you to essentially put your head inside the engine bay to see it. The casting mark was there, pressed into the iron in raised numerals. ZO3 1963, March of 1963. Keanu did not make a sound. He held the light steady and read the mark 3 times. Vance Holloway had described this mark in an old VHS tape that Keanu's housekeeper had digitized for him. Years ago, a tape Keanu had watched so many times he could recite the relevant section from memory. If you ever find a block cast in March of 63, with the CGT prefix on the chassis, you look for the chassis plate immediately. Do not stop for anything. He withdrew his head from the engine bay, stood up straight, and for a moment he simply breathed. The chassis plate, in the standard location, had been removed. The mounting holes were there, slightly darkened with age, the thread pattern intact, but empty. This was not unusual for a car that had passed through many hands over 60 years. What mattered was the secondary location. Factory race cars of that era almost always had a backup identification point, a fallback stamp applied by the build team, placed somewhere inconvenient enough that a casual disassembly would miss it. Keanu removed the glove compartment housing, 4 screws, a 10-minute job. He reached into the recess behind it with a handheld lamp. The stamp was there, cut directly into the frame rail, 6 characters, CGTR 0001. He sat down on the workshop floor with his back against the rear wheel and stayed there for a while. CGTR 0001, the chassis number of the Callaway GTR 0, the only one ever built, the car that the historical record said had burned in the Callaway Racing warehouse fire on the 14th of November 1965. He got up, went back to the firewall, and checked the third thing. Behind the engine bay, pressed between the two layers of the firewall structure, a hand-welded reinforcement bar ran diagonally across the upper section. The weld angle was not perfectly symmetrical. It was not meant to be. It was the deliberate signature of a craftsman who worked by feel rather than by jig. Approximately 73 degrees of angle. A habit so individual it had been documented in a single technical history paper published 30 years ago by the American Automotive Heritage Institute. The paper's author had described the technique as belonging exclusively to one man, Chief Fabricator Arthur Holloway, Vance's older brother. Lila appeared at the workshop doorway at 3 in the morning, her hair uncombed, marbles hanging from one hand, bare feet on the concrete step. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I am fine," he said. "Go back to sleep." She looked at him, then at the car, with the evaluating gaze children deploy when they suspect adults are underreporting. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Keanu looked at the car for a long moment. "I think I might have," he said. She padded back to bed. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he had not used in 2 years. Dr. Wendell Holloway was 72 years old, retired from the directorship of the American Automotive Heritage Institute, and the only living authority on Callaway Racing's factory operations. He was also Vance's son and Arthur's nephew. Keanu had met him twice in person, once as a young man on the set of a film in Detroit, when Vance had brought him to a vintage racing conference, and once 5 years ago when Wendell had come to the Brooklyn workshop to authenticate a set of period documents Keanu had inherited. When Keanu called at 8 in the morning on the third day, he did not explain the full situation. He simply read 3 pieces of information from his notes. 03-1963, CGTR 0001, hand-welded firewall bar, approximately 73 degrees. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Keanu checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Wendell said, in a voice that had become very quiet and very careful, "Send me photographs. Every photograph you have. Right now." Keanu sent 47 images. 2 hours later, Wendell called back on video. He had a colleague with him, a Belgian academic named Dr. Caron, one of the few surviving researchers who had worked directly with original Callaway factory records in the 1990s. Dr. Caron went through the photographs one by one, without speaking for close to 20 minutes. When he finally did speak, it was in accented but precise English, and he addressed his first comment not to Keanu, but to the image of the firewall bar on the screen in front of him. "The weld," he said, 73 degrees. "This is Arthur's technique." Wendell translated the weight of that. Though it needed no translation, my uncle welded this car. There was a silence in the call that was different from ordinary silence. The kind that comes when something long believed impossible turns out to be simply unlikely, which is a different category entirely. Wendell looked at Keanu through the screen and spoke directly. "If the engine is original, unmolested, unreplaced, and if the chassis stamp is what you say it is, then what you have is the GTR 0, the only one. There is no second car. The fire destroyed the records and the components, but not the car." Keanu asked the question that needed asking, estimated value. Wendell was quiet for a moment. "We need formal authentication before anyone says a number. But speaking conservatively about the current market for factory prototype race cars of this significance, I would say 7 to 9 million is a careful estimate. It could go higher." Keanu ended the call. He set the phone face down on the workbench and stood at the workshop window, looking out at the narrow street. Across the sidewalk, Lila was in the small fenced yard beside the workshop building, walking marbles along the top of the fence railing with great concentration, narrating a story to herself. In a voice too low to hear, he watched her for a long time. Then, he turned back to the workshop and began preparing the car for a more thorough inspection. The black Range Rover appeared outside the workshop. At 9 in the morning on the 5th day, Keanu saw it from the second-floor window while he was making coffee. Idling, engine, tinted glass, the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a vehicle waiting for its driver to do something rather than go somewhere. Bennett Cross came through the front door without knocking, because men like Bennett Cross did not knock on the doors of repair shops. He had a young attorney with him, briefcase, expensive haircut, the slightly rigid bearing of someone who had been told this would be a short meeting. Bennett looked at the workshop. The tools hung on pegboard, the lift hydraulics, the calendar from a parts supplier on the wall, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unimpressed and calculating. He did not at first recognize the man in the t-shirt and jeans standing at the coffee maker. Then he did. His expression flickered through three things, quickly, and settled on something more careful than where it had started. "You bought a car at the Bellamy session 2 days ago," he said. "I bought a car," Keanu confirmed. "Everything processed correctly. I have the paperwork." Bennett smiled with one side of his mouth. "I am not here about the paperwork. I want to buy it back from you." The attorney placed an open folder on the workbench, a contract already prepared. A number printed in bold at the top, $200,000, wire transfer. Same day. Keanu did not look at the folder. "No," he said. Bennett paused in the way of a man unaccustomed to that word being the first and only one offered. "You paid $11,500. I am offering $200. That is a reasonable offer." "No," Keanu said again. "Same way." Bennett's expression shifted into something more deliberate, the social smile replaced by the face he presumably wore in negotiations he expected to win. The estate family has their own attorneys looking at the terms of the original sale. There may be a question about whether items of exceptional undisclosed value were properly represented in the estate inventory. The attorney shifted his weight slightly, which told Keanu that this particular argument had some technical merit and some significant gaps. The lot was sold as is. No warranty, no representation of value, Keanu said. Bellamy Crestmont made no claims about the car in either direction. I reviewed the sale terms before I placed a bid. The purchase is legally complete. The attorney's slight shift became a slight stillness, which was more informative. Bennett studied Keanu for a moment, with the recalibrating attention of someone who had expected a shorter conversation. Lila appeared in the interior doorway, connecting the workshop to the stairwell, marbles under her arm, looking at the unfamiliar man with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend she was not looking. Bennett glanced at her, then back at Keanu, and when he looked at Keanu again, something in his expression had changed. A new calculation, a different kind of leverage being considered. Keanu did not look at Lila. $300,000, Bennett said. Final. Keanu turned his head toward the doorway. "Lila," he said, very calmly, "go upstairs, please." When the sound of her footsteps had faded on the stairs, Keanu looked at Bennett Cross and said, in a voice that was quiet and completely even, "You should get in your car and leave before I call my attorney." Bennett Cross left. He paused at the door and turned back once, not to speak, just to look at the car on the lift, still in its olive green paint, still battered and dusty, and to any eye but the right one entirely worthless. His expression was not the expression of a man who had given up. Keanu watched the Range Rover pull away, picked up his phone, and called Wendell Holloway. "We need to move faster," he said. Wendell drove down from Boston the next morning in his old Volvo, arriving at the Brooklyn workshop at 10 with a leather document case under one arm and a 35mm film camera in a canvas bag over his shoulder. He parked at the curb, came through the open roll-up door, and stopped just inside, looking at the car from 15 feet away, as still as someone who had waited a very long time for something and was not sure yet whether it was what they had hoped. He set his bags down and approached slowly, the way you approach something fragile. Not because the car was fragile, but because the moment was. He crouched beside the engine bay, and when he pressed his palm flat against the diagonal weld bar on the firewall, his voice was low and not quite steady. "This is my uncle's weld." He was not talking to Keanu. He was talking to the metal, or to a version of the room that existed some 60 years before the present one. The authentication took 3 hours, Wendell worked with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 50 years doing this, photographing everything on film. He did not trust digital for records of this significance. Cross-referencing each finding against documents, he had brought in the leather case, original Callaway factory blueprints, his uncle's hand-annotated build logs, a fragmentary set of supplier invoices from 1962 and 1963. The chassis stamp matched, the block casting date matched, the weld geometry matched. And then Wendell found something even Keanu had not found, because it required knowing specifically where to look and why it might be there. Tucked into a narrow recess along the inner dash rail, clipped to the frame steel with a small metal fastener, was a cylinder of thin plastic housing, the kind of improvised preservation case that a careful man might construct from materials available in a factory tool room. Inside the cylinder, rolled around a short wooden dowel, was a single sheet of paper, a build sheet, a factory production record, dated the 31st of March 1963, chassis designation CGTR 0001, engine designation CBRV 80003, signed at the bottom, A. Holloway, Senior Fabricator. The handwriting was the compact left-leaning cursive of someone who had written production notes in the margins of Blutz for 30 years. Wendell held the paper in both hands, without speaking for a very long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. He hid it here, he said. He knew the car would not be burned. He hid the proof. Keanu stood at the doorway of the workshop, hands in his pockets, the late afternoon light coming in at an angle across the floor. The Lila had come down from upstairs and was standing beside him, her small hand wrapped around two of his fingers, watching the old man at the workbench with the gravity of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if she could not name it. By 5, Wendell had signed and notarized the formal authentication certificate. The document stated, in the precise and unambiguous language of someone who had spent a career preparing to write exactly this sentence, that the vehicle bearing chassis number CGTR 0001, engine casting dated March 1963, and factory build sheet signed by Arthur Holloway was the Callaway GTR 0 factory prototype, the only surviving example, and that its estimated fair market value in the current collector automobile market fell between $7.5 and $9 million, with potential for a higher realized price at auction. Given the historical uniqueness of the piece, Wendell shook Keanu's hand at the front door, holding it for a moment before letting go. "How did you find it?" he asked. Keanu glanced down at Lila, who was leaning against the door frame, marbles balanced on top of her head. "Your father taught me how to look," he said. Wendell nodded. Got in his Volvo, drove north into the early evening. Keanu went inside and called the main line for Bellamy Crestmont auctions. The call was transferred twice before reaching Margaret Bellamy directly, which was unusual for an unsolicited inbound. She answered with the practiced efficiency of someone managing a dense schedule, and Keanu said what needed to be said without preamble. He owned the Callaway GTR 0. It had been formally authenticated by Dr. Wendell Holloway, and he wanted to sell it through Bellamy Crestmont in a dedicated single-lot auction. There was a silence on the line that was different from the processing pauses of normal business conversation. Longer, shaped differently. The silence of someone rearranging a mental picture, rather than retrieving information. "Lot 47, Margaret said. "Yes," Keanu said. Another silence. "I will need to see the authentication documents. Dr. Holloway is available for a direct call if you need it." There was the sound of something being set down carefully on a hard surface. "We will schedule a special session," she said. "Friday. We will handle all the preparation on our end." Her voice had retained its professional precision, but had shed something else, a particular quality of controlled authority that had been present in every previous exchange. The vocal equivalent of looking at someone from a height. "May I ask who I am speaking with for the record?" she said. Keanu Reeves. The silence that followed was the third silence of the call, and it was the longest. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I will personally oversee the preparation." "Thank you," he said, and ended the call. That evening, Lila sat on the high stool beside his workbench, while he worked on a 1968 muscle car that had nothing remarkable about it, except that it ran, and its owner needed it back by the following week. "Are you selling the dirty car?" she asked. "Yes," he said, not looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. "Well, you just got it." He set down the float and thought about how to answer in a way that was true and small enough to carry. "Because some things do not belong in just one person's workshop," he said. She considered this, turning marbles over in her hands. "Like a library book," she said. He looked at her. "Exactly like a library book," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She watched him work until her eyes started closing, and then he carried her upstairs without waking her, pulled the blanket up, and went back down to finish the carburetor. Bellamy Crestmont sent the press release at 8 on Friday morning. Special single-lot session. 1963 Callaway GTR 0, sole surviving factory prototype, authenticated by Dr. Wendell Holloway. Consigyor's name was withheld at the consigyor's request, but the room knew. The room always knows. By 10, 3 international automotive history publications had picked up the announcement. 12 international bidders had registered for remote access. The main bidding room at the Bellamy venue had more people in it by 11:30 than it typically saw at its flagship spring sales. Keanu drove across the bridge in the same pickup, Lila beside him in a navy dress with marbles on her lap. He wore a black button-down shirt and dark jeans, no suit, no tie, nothing that would have made him unrecognizable to anyone who had seen him 3 days earlier, crouching beside a car nobody wanted. He parked, took Lila's hand, and walked through the main entrance. People looked, not because of what he was wearing, but because the press release had not needed to name him for anyone in this particular industry to figure it out. Devon Whitaker met them at the main door with 2 access cards. She looked at Lila with genuine warmth. "What is your name?" she asked, crouching slightly to meet the child's eye level. "Lila," the girl said. "And this is Marbles." Devon smiled the kind of smile that belongs to a person rather than a professional role, and led them to the seller's waiting area, a quiet room off the main hall with upholstered chairs and a window overlooking the street. Bennett Cross was already in the bidding room when Keanu walked through before the session began, seated in the second row. Arms folded, jaw set in the particular expression of a man who had decided he could still salvage something from a situation that had moved substantially against him. He had registered to bid. Keanu noted this and said nothing about it. Wendell was in the front row, his leather document case on the seat beside him, watching the car, which had been brought in on a low platform, cleaned carefully but not restored, every original surface intact and honest, with the patient attention of someone sitting with a very old friend. Margaret Bellamy stepped up to the podium. The room quieted. She introduced the lot with the precise historical language that the authentication documents provided, reading from notes she had clearly prepared carefully. And then she opened the bidding at $2 million. $2 million became $4 million in the first 15 seconds. 3 international phone bidders coming in simultaneously from the remote lines. $4 million became 5.8 before 30 seconds had elapsed. Bennett Cross raised his paddle at $6 million, and the figure climbed past him. 6.5 from a Swiss collector on screen. 7 million from Cross. 7.8 from the screen. Cross, 8 million. The screen went quiet. Margaret looked out over the room, her voice steady. 8 million going once. No movement from the screens. Keanu was standing at the side of the room near the wall, one hand resting on Lila's shoulder. She did not understand the numbers. They were too large, too abstract, outside the scale of anything in her daily life. But she was watching her father's face and reading. What was there with the acuity that children develop when they have learned to pay close attention to the adults they depend on? 8 million going twice. The room held its breath. The gavel came down. Sold $8,200,000. The room released. Applause, the murmur of voices, the soft percussion of phones being raised. Bennett Cross stood, buttoned his jacket without looking at anyone, and walked out through the side door with the unhurried gait of a man managing a defeat in public. Wendell did not stand. He sat in the front row and looked at the car on the platform, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes gone bright and wet. Keanu looked down at Lila. She looked up at him. She did not ask about the number. She held Marbles tighter with one arm and put her other hand into his. The consequences for Margaret Bellamy began before she made it back to her office. By the time the auction had cleared the room, 3 of the journalists in attendance had already filed the story, and a photograph of Margaret at the podium next to a photograph of the work-jacketed figure from Tuesday's preview, sourced from the venue's own internal security feed and leaked within hours, was on the front page of 2 automotive publications and a New York Metro tabloid. The framing wrote itself. The headline in the Post read, "CEO calls world-famous actor's $8 million find, quote, scrap metal, yun." The Times took a calmer angle and was therefore worse for her. What broke open the situation, though, was not the celebrity angle. It was Devon Whitaker. On Saturday morning, Devon sent an email to the Bellamy Crestmont Board of Directors with 3 attachments: a spreadsheet of 17 instances over a 4-year period in which Margaret had made dismissive or contemptuous remarks toward attendees she had judged to be the wrong kind of buyer, 3 signed witness statements from former Bellamy employees, and a copy of an internal training memo written by Margaret herself, in which she had described a category of preview attendee. Quote, that we should be discreetly steered toward less prominent lots so as not to dilute the room's energy for serious bidders. Unquote. The board met on Sunday. On Monday morning, at 7:15, 3 former auction attendees gave interviews on a morning news program. A retired postal worker from Yonkers named Earl Vance, who had inherited a collection of vintage watches from his late wife, and had brought them to Bellamy for appraisal in 2022, only to be told in front of other attendees that the venue had a, quote, certain caliber of consignor it preferred to work with, unquote. A high school art teacher from Bay Ridge named Cora Mendelssohn, who had attended a Bellamy preview wearing a knee-length winter coat from a department store and had been intercepted by a Bellamy staff member at the door and politely informed that the preview was, quote, by invitation only, unquote, despite the fact that the preview was public and she was holding the public invitation. And a third witness, a Marine Corps veteran from the Bronx named Dale Brennan, whose interview was the one that landed hardest because he simply described, in a flat, emotional voice, being escorted out of the building by security after asking a question about a lot that Margaret Bellamy had decided he should not be asking about. By Monday noon, 4 longtime Bellamy clients, 3 of whom were named in the trade press as significant private collectors, had publicly announced they were terminating their consignment relationships. By Tuesday afternoon, the board had asked for Margaret's resignation. She did not resign, not at first. In a written statement issued through her personal attorney, she said that her remarks had been, quote, taken out of context, unquote, that her management approach reflected, quote, industry standard practices regarding clientele curation, unquote, and that she stood by, quote, every professional judgment I have made in the service of protecting the standards of this institution, unquote. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge a single individual she had insulted. She did not name Keanu Reeves or Earl Vance or Cora Mendelssohn or Dale Brennan. The board terminated her contract on Wednesday morning for cause, citing the training memo. She lost her severance package, her equity stake, and the non-compete buyout that her contract would otherwise have triggered. She filed a wrongful termination suit 2 weeks later. It was dismissed at summary judgment 6 months after that. The judge's written opinion contained a sentence that the trade press quoted for years afterward, to the effect that the plaintiff's own contemporaneous writings, when entered into evidence, constituted the most efficient case for her dismissal that the defense could possibly have hoped to present. 6 months after the auction, the Bellamy Crestmont board promoted Devon Whitaker to interim CEO. She accepted on the condition that the company adopt a new internal standard, which the trade press began calling the Whitaker Protocol. Every employee was retrained. The hiring criteria for floor staff were rewritten. The complimentary care room near the entrance was renovated and expanded, and a small brass plate was installed above the doorway with no name on it, just a date. The date of the Friday afternoon auction, the first preview session held under the new protocol, included by no particular coincidence a 65-year-old machinist from Detroit, who had brought his late father's collection of mechanical drafting tools for appraisal. Nobody laughed. Nobody glanced sideways. Devon walked over to him personally and shook his hand and asked him about his father. Keanu did not attend any of the subsequent press cycles. He did not give an interview. He did not write a social media post about what had happened. When a reporter from a major paper asked him in the lobby of his agent's office whether he had any comment on Margaret Bellamy's dismissal, he looked at her for a moment with that particular, unhurried calm that the room had not known how to read on the Tuesday morning in the back corner of the auction hall. He said, "I have nothing to add." The reporter, who had expected something, looked down at her notepad and then back up, and he had already walked past her toward the elevator. That same afternoon, he took the F train from 57th Street back to Greenpoint, the way he always did. He carried a small canvas bag with a sandwich from the deli around the corner from his agent's building. He sat in a corner seat and read a paperback. A young man sitting across from him recognized him after about 3 stops and made the particular face people make when they have decided to behave well, and Keanu nodded at him once, slightly, and went back to the book. The young man got off at Bedford. Nobody else paid attention. He walked the 4 blocks from the station to the workshop, opened the door, and Lila was sitting on the high stool beside the bench, with marbles on top of the toolbox in the same architectural arrangement as the night before. "What did you do today?" she asked. Same way she always asked, as though the answer would decide an important matter. "Looked at a car," he said. "Was it a good one? I do not know yet. Still looking." She considered this. "Like the dirty one," she said. "Like the dirty one," he agreed. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her arrangement. That evening, locking up the workshop, his phone buzzed on the bench. A text message from an unknown number, though the initials at the bottom identified the sender clearly enough. "I want to apologize for what I said that morning. Not because of what the car turned out to be, but because I judged before I looked. I understand now what that cost and what it could have cost." MB, he read it once. Then a second time he typed a reply. "Thank you for writing this. KR." He set the phone down. He stood for a minute in the dim of the workshop. Outside, a single street lamp threw a long rectangle across the concrete floor, and in it, the 1968 muscle car sat on the lift. Nothing special, nothing hidden. Just a car that needed work. He looked at it for a while anyway. Habit. The habit Vance Holloway had taught him. The habit of looking at ordinary things long enough and carefully enough that sometimes the ordinary things turn out to be something else entirely. There are things people walk past without any obvious reason to stop. There are things parked in the backs of rooms, tagged and priced and ignored by almost everyone, waiting for the one person who knows where to look and why. Most people never meet that person, and that person, quietly, without hurry. Wrong by the world's first count and right by everyone's count afterward, almost never announces themselves. They just crouch down at the end of the hall, shine a small flashlight under a car everyone else has written off, and see what nobody else bothered to find. Not because they were lucky, because somebody a long time ago taught them how to look.